Today, Russia is arguably one of the most controversial countries on the planet. Much is said about them one way or the other, primarily due to Vladimir Putin, and very few countries have as many stereotypes, especially negative ones, floating around about them. While it's understandable for many Westerners to be worried about Russian influence on their governments or their people, it's also important to be able to separate the Russian people and culture from their government and to understand who the Russians really are, and not just what we know about them from some crude and demeaning stereotypes. Number 10. Russians don't look at governance the same way that many Westerners do. Many Americans and other Western countries have trouble understanding Russians' idea of governance because Westerners cannot imagine having a life where they could have so little personal freedom. To Westerners, personal freedom, or at least the appearance of it, is practically a life or death matter. Now, Russians, they see things differently. It isn't that they are naturally submissive or something, but the Russian people have never really had anything like democracy that the many Western countries enjoy. When you haven't had something in the first place, you're hardly going to find yourself missing it or somehow greatly fighting for it. For this reason, personal freedoms are a much lower priority for many Russians, and they don't entirely understand why so many countries are worried about these issues. This is particularly the case when you can look at those other countries and be like, you've got loads of problems too. Now, that doesn't mean that Russians aren't interested in democracy, you're just not likely to find many people who are willing to risk prison for something they never even had to begin with. Number 9. Russians look European but are also sort of Asian. One of the reasons that Westerners might struggle to understand Russians is that they look really similar to us, but they think quite differently. This likely stems from their cultural origins. The larger portion of Russia is geographically essentially in Asia, but the more populated part is in what some call European Russia, a portion of Russia that's still considered part of Eastern Europe. This is all quite confusing, and borders are, of course, all man-made to begin with, but the overall issue is that the Russian people hardly fit in any normal cultural box. Even the ones from European Russia are still much further east than many people who are considered to be from Europe, and this likely changes their thinking. They're also part of a country that has much of its territory in the actual continent of Asia, which means many people from the European part will still have their culture influenced by the more Asian part. For this reason, many Russians have said that they feel like they have an identity which is part Asian and part Eastern European. Number 8. Napoleon made them incredibly paranoid long ago, and now other people think they're aggressive. Americans hear Tchaikovsky's Overture of 1812 and think that it's about the American War of 1812. However, at that same time in history, there was a war going on basically all over the world because of this dude called Napoleon. This guy had been stirring up the nest all over the place and even had pushed his way into Russia. Now, today, many people look at this as a folly of Napoleon and talk about how Hitler later repeated the same mistake, attacking the hardy Russian people during the harsh winter. However, the truth was that Napoleon came far closer, at least in Russians' minds, to completing a successful invasion than they were comfortable with. They were terrified, and they never forgot it. Well over 100 years later, the term Bonapartist would still be a common term in Russia. They feared the idea of a warrior general rising up and going on some sort of rampage so much that they immortalized Napoleon's name with a specific word for his invasion into their country. Many people today think that Russians are just aggressive, but this near miss so long ago drove them to shore up their borders. This is the primary reason they've been hostile to their closest neighbors ever since. The truth is that Russia only won with scorched earth tactics and great losses. Napoleon, he simply scarred them forever. Number 7. Russian national pride goes a long way back, but has clashed with French culture. Some people don't understand why Russians are willing to forego so much comfort for the good of their country, and many people like to claim that it's Soviet propaganda. But the Russian people have been behaving like this for some time now. Considering that Russia is really one of the oldest surviving countries and cultures in the world, it's not surprising that they have a gigantic wellspring of national pride, whether the situation warrants it or not. They also have a long history of dictatorships, which means that they're used to being proud of their country while letting other people run it. Now, this doesn't mean that Russians have always remained truly proud and obsessed with Slavic culture. A situation that still exists today but blew up shortly after the time of Napoleon is the fight between Slavophiles and the Francophiles. The Slavophiles wanted to keep Russians Slavic and focus on Slavic cultures, traditions, dress, and customs. However, enthralled and enraptured by the French, many young people were dressing in French fashions, taking up their customs and studying their culture and their language. This has changed the Russian people even further over the years, and if anything, it has made them even more incomprehensible to the rest of the world. Number 6. The Russian concept of Poshlost explains why they often think of wealth differently. These days you have people who like to make fun of the Kardashians or joke about how they became famous for doing literally nothing at all. However, at the same time, many of those same people view being in a position like the Kardashians as something to aspire to. Now, despite misconceptions, the Kardashians still have a lot of work to do in maintaining their empire of nothing. But many see their lifestyle as an aspiration because it's perceived as a life where they can just chill and enjoy the finer things while not actually having to go to work. In many ways, this almost makes them the ultimate American dream, but Russians would find the whole thing ridiculous. While there are Russian billionaires today and Russia has a whole lot of corruption, those who are at least in business or working are given a great deal of respect by the common person, regardless of their ridiculous wealth. It's only the playboys who don't really work or do anything that get disrespect. In Russian literature, there's a concept that many of the greats like Pushkin or Lermontov wrote about, and it's called Poshlost. Poshlost has been called untranslatable, but we're going to try our best to explain the concept. It's used to refer to outer beauty or empty wealth that is flaunted, while the individuals behind that wealth spend most of their time lounging, trying to look important and contributing nothing of value to society at all. In a way, it was a backlash to the fashionable trappings of high society brought forth by the Francophile fad. Number 5. The idea of struggle is entirely embedded in the Russian cultural ethos. One of the things many people in America in particular understand least about the Russians is their willingness to accept a life without a lot of particular luxuries and without a lot of options in general. This isn't because the Russians are just masochistic and enjoy taking punishment or are trying to prove some kind of specific point, nor are the Russian people necessarily taking one for the team in order to advance the cause of the current government. The biggest reason most Russians are okay with things being the way they are is because, well, within their ethos, the idea of struggle is deeply embedded. In many ways, it may be their most important cultural value. Working hard and muddling through to get by is seen as extremely important. For a culture that's often had to deal with poverty and want, even under their most benevolent leaders, this was something that they had to learn as a people very early on. In many ways, it defines them and explains why they are willing to accept what many in Western cultures would consider unacceptable. They are simply far more accustomed to hardship, so they don't act like everything is all out of sorts when things get a little difficult. Number 4. The origins of their language and its structure give them a unique perspective. The Russian language uses the Cyrillic alphabet. However, the origin of their written language is rather strange. The people of the region mostly used spoken word and wrote little down when two Catholic missionaries named Cyril and Methodius traveled to the region. These two decided to help create an alphabet and written word system for the language spoken by the people of the region, and something similar is used today in many Slavic countries. Now, this gives them a rather unique language structure and perspective. The language itself was formed entirely by natives of the region, but the written form was made up mostly by outsiders who didn't entirely understand their thinking. This has created a language system where the written words, and as they've evolved together, sometimes even the spoken word, are hard to articulate the way the writer would want. Many writers, like Pushkin, took the written form of Russian to its limits to extract as much wordplay as possible, but they could only go so far, despite their genius. Number 3. Russians are generally thought of as a drunk country, but there's a lot more to it. One of the biggest stereotypes about Russians is that they like to drink. People talk about teens using mouthwash, hand sanitizer, and other awful things, but in any country with poverty and bored children, things like that aren't uncommon. And while people like to act like the average Russian just pounds alcohol like there's no tomorrow, even among the heavy drinkers, there are customs to drinking, and it's only when you ignore them and actually do start pounding for no reason that you actually have a real problem. In Russia, drinking is a big social thing, but it's also accompanied by lots of food, toasting with friends, and good conversation and camaraderie in general. Russians like to toast to things when drinking, so they have a reason to imbibe, and it's custom to eat a bit of food after each drink or shot. The idea behind this is that it's both good for you and helps avoid a hangover. Many Russians will simply not drink if they don't at least have a bit of bread so they can have a little bite after each sip. Number 2. Internet pirates are often Russian, but it's due to poverty, not cultural dishonesty. The Pirate Bay and other popular torrent sites have always had a huge amount of torrents coming from Russian hackers. Many people who pirate a lot will have probably come across movies with Russian subtitles. Now, some people have noticed this and come to the conclusion that Russians are inherently dishonest or thieves, but this isn't the case. For starters, an incredible amount of Westerners use torrent sites, even middle-class Westerners, so it's a little bit hypocritical to brand Russians as thieves. However, more to the point, many common Russian folk feel compelled to do these things because they are desperately poor and simply cannot afford the content otherwise. In many cases, it may not even be available for legitimate purchase within their country, so they have to resort to piracy in order to get past government censorship. Russians aren't generally just a bunch of horrible cyber thieves, well, at least not any more than most other countries. And also, while Russians aren't necessarily more dishonest, they are better educated than many countries when it comes to IT. Number 1. The Russian people usually know full well when they're being fed propaganda. A lot of people think that the Russian people are easily fooled or that old Putin has completely pulled the wool over their eyes. They believe that Putin's propaganda machine has managed to get people under his spell and that they are basically putty in his hands. However, the situation, and the Russian people by extension, are a lot more complex than that. The Russian people are well aware of the concept of propaganda and have a word called pravda, which some of you may be familiar with due to the ironically named Soviet propaganda paper of the same name. Now, for those of us who aren't aware, pravda means truth, but it can also mean a lot more or a lot less than that. Some know that pravda was used sarcastically as a phrase to subtly disagree with Soviet propaganda, but most Westerners don't know how long this phrase has been in use or how many things it can mean. And it literally does mean dozens of things. After all, Russians may not have as many words as some other languages, so they often use the same word to mean many different things. Pravda can mean the literal truth, but it can also mean that you know you aren't being told the truth and are very slightly sarcastically saying, "Oh yes, of course I believe that," when you really know it's a lie. And this is the funny thing about the Russian propaganda machine. It often knows that it's not fooling anyone. The people know that they're being fooled, but they pretend that the propaganda is working to avoid any kind of confrontation with the government. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below and don't forget to subscribe. We got brand new videos 7 days a week. Also, check out some videos from the archives that I'm linking to on the screen now. And as always, thank you for watching.